Hello, my name is Valerie, and I'm a docent at the Royal Ontario Museum and the Art Gallery of Ontario, both in Toronto. I'm a lifelong lover of art. Today we'll look at the life and work of a Canadian icon, Emily Carr. She was a West Coast artist working in British Columbia, including what is now Haida, Gwaii. We'll also take a brief look at some of the controversy surrounding her work in recent years. Early in her career, Emily dedicated herself to documenting the Canadian West Coast Indigenous culture that seemed to her to be a thing of the past. Later, she struggled to discover a way to express herself as an individual artist. As she matured, she grappled with the spiritual questions that the Canadian landscape itself inspired in her. Emily Carr was the second youngest of 9 children born to wealthy British Presbyterian immigrants. Her father had made his small fortune during the California gold rush. They chose Victoria as a place to settle because it was so English. The children had a very strict upbringing, but Emily was and remained all her life a free spirit. Only one son, Richard, grew up, and he died as a young adult, leaving Emily and her 4 sisters. She gave them all nicknames, and hers was Small. Alice, who is front and center in the photo, became a teacher and was her frequent travel companion. Richard Carr had this family home built on Government Street in Victoria in 1864, and is still there as a museum. Look carefully and you can see Richard, his wife Emily, and their children to date assembled on the front porch. Emily showed an early talent for drawing, and her father organized private art lessons for her and her sisters with a local artist named Emily Woods. Emily, signed here as Millie, always had a problem with spelling, as you can see in this early drawing. Her mother died of TB when Emily was 15, and her father died 2 years later. Always his favorite, she had a falling out with him after he apparently tried to explain to her the facts of life when she reached puberty. She later called it the brutal telling and never disclosed the full circumstances, but the shock stayed with her all her life. Emily became the ward of her older sister, who was also very strict. When she was 19, she decided she wanted to become a professional artist and got permission to enroll at the San Francisco School of Design. After 3 years, she had to return home due to dwindling family funds. She was not satisfied with the paintings she produced in San Francisco, calling them humdrum, unemotional, objects honestly portrayed, nothing more. Back at the family home, Emily enthusiastically converted the cow barn into her studio, which also became her art school, and she taught children's art classes. She wrote, "No studio has ever been so dear to me as that old loft, smelling of hay and apples, new sawed wood, Monday washings, earthy garden tools." In the summer of 1899, Emily made a trip to Ucluelet to visit one of her sisters, who was a missionary's wife. This was the first of many trips to First Nations villages on the coast of BC and beyond. The villagers called her Clee Wick, which means laughing one, and the nickname stuck. This was the beginning of her love for both the people and the carvings, which were all from a past era, as pole carving was no longer allowed by law. Later that year, Emily traveled to London and enrolled in the Westminster School of Art. Shortly after, she heard the dreadful news of her brother's death, but bravely continued with her studies. In 1900, Emily had a visit from a young man she had met on the steamer coming back from Ucluelet. His name was Mayo Padden, and he was smitten with her. In her journal, she recorded that he proposed 5 times a day, but in the end, she rejected him. Her excuse to him was that she was perverse, but she didn't love him and was not prepared to give up becoming an artist to be his wife. She always felt guilty for rejecting him. Westminster had once been a reputable school, but had declined, and she was taught a traditional 19th century course of study. The art she produced at Westminster, such as chrysanthemums, was conventional for the time, and she was disappointed. You can see from the facial expressions in her drawing that it was not a happy time for her. She left the school after 2 years and sought out private art lessons. She also took brief trips to Scotland and Paris and visited the Louvre Museum for the first time. In 1901, Alice Carr arrived in England and the sisters traveled to Devon and Cornwall. Emily enrolled at art school in St. Ives, Cornwall, which was and still is an artist's haven, and stayed over the winter on a course of study, as we can see in this photo, where Emily is third from the left. Overwork exhausted Emily, and she struggled with her mental health. Complete rest was advised, and in January 1903, she checked into an English sanatorium, where she received some psychiatric treatment. She was not the type to rest and kept busy by sketching and raising wild birds. You can see her feeding birds in a nest in the drawing on the left. Her often humorous notebook account of her stay was published posthumously as Pause in 1956. She never seemed to lose her sense of humor, despite periods of extreme mood swings. She was released from the hospital more than a year later and returned to Canada. En route to Victoria, she enjoyed a holiday at the ranch of friends in the Caribou region of BC. Riding and open spaces did a lot to restore her health, as you can see in this happy photo. Back home at the Carr family property, she also took a job creating weekly pen and ink political cartoons for a Victorian publication called The Week, using the nom de plume spuds. She also visited Ucluelet again as soon as she could. Emily moved to Victoria in 1906 and lived there until 1910. She got a job teaching at the elite Vancouver Studio Club, but the mostly female adult students did not take kindly to Emily's ideas about art. She again opened her own studio and gave children's art classes, which were so popular that she was invited to teach in private Vancouver schools. In July 1907, on vacation from teaching, Emily and Alice traveled by steamship from Seattle to Alaska, stopping at First Nations villages on the way up and back down the BC coast. Her interest in the villages, and especially the monumental poles, became very intense on this trip. These poles had been relocated and set up as a tourist attraction. Emily resolved to paint poles in their own setting and to document what she saw as a vanishing way of life. She later wrote, "My mind was made up. I was going to picture the totem poles in their own village settings, as complete a collection of them as I could." Soon after, Emily made several journeys to BC, First Nations communities in Sechelt, Lytton, Hope, Alert Bay, and Campbell River, and continued to paint and teach in Vancouver. Victoria's Beacon Hill Park bordered on the Carr family home, so Emily had spent a lot of time there. This very genteel watercolor would have appealed to middle-class Victorians, as it was in keeping with the 19th century English pictorial tradition, with its balanced composition, aerial perspective, and neutral color palette. It's in stark contrast to the way her art would evolve over the coming decades. The transition began when Emily started to hear about the new ideas about art that were percolating in Europe. These are works by 3 of several artists linked to post-impressionism. We must remember that names of art movements are given by art critics or historians, not by the artists themselves. The Impressionists had been primarily concerned with light and its effects on color and form, often sacrificing form altogether. Post-Impressionists generally brought form back. Cézanne reduced objects to their basic shapes and inspired the birth of Cubism a few years later, while Van Gogh used thick paint to express emotions, as did the German Expressionists. Gauguin became best known for his often spiritual Tahitian paintings and flattening of space. All of them were influenced by the treatment of space revealed in recently discovered Japanese woodcut prints. Van Gogh and other artists had a collection of them. Fauve means wild beasts and was a derogatory term used by contemporary critics. Fauvists rejected naturalism and emphasized bold color and expressive movement. Georges Braque soon went on to co-found Cubism with Pablo Picasso. Emily and Alice set off to check out the new art they'd been hearing so much about. They had realized that Paris, not London, was where a lot of it was happening. This is another humorous illustration from one of her notebooks, in which she regularly documented her daily life and work. In France, Emily chose teachers that were English speaking and who had already studied and were practicing the new art. She contacted the artist William Phelan Gibb, sometimes called Harry, who became her mentor and most influential instructor. He was a friend of Matisse, so had first-hand experience with Fauvism and its artists. She at first enrolled in the Académie Colarossi, then transferred to private lessons with John Ferguson and followed him to the Atelier Blanche. Later, she had lessons with Francis Hodgkins, who was a New Zealand artist working in France. You can see by the title of this work, Study in Color and Form, that Emily was being taught the modernist approach of using the basic elements and principles of art when working from a subject, rather than being distracted by its details. Look at the transformation in her treatment of landscape in this joyful painting. I tramped the countryside, sketch sack on shoulder. The fields were lovely, lying like a spread of gay patchwork against red gold wheat, cool pale oats, red purple of new-turned soil, green grass, and orderly, well-trimmed trees. Emily began to understand the concept of capturing the unity, vibrancy, and structure of the landscape, rather than naturalistic rendering. Following another bout of ill health and hospitalization, Emily joined Phelan Gibb and his wife in a small village in Brittany. Here, she fully embraced the fauve style of bold color and broad brushwork, conveying both light and emotion through color. This wonderful composition of space, form, line, and color embraces all the principles of the new approach to art. It presents as a joyful work inspired by nature. Harry Gibb admired her new confidence and said to her, "Those others don't know what they're after, but you do." These are rare interior figure studies. Her real joy was working outdoors. When she returned to Paris, she was thrilled to find that 2 of her large landscape paintings had been jury selected and hung in the prestigious Salon d'Automne, This was a huge achievement for any artist. With boosted confidence, she returned to Canada. She re-established herself in Vancouver, both as an art teacher and professional artist, and exhibited the work she'd done in France. Sales from this show helped finance her next goal. She was anxious to return to her mission of creating what she called her Indian collection of poles and villages of the BC coast, but this time to paint with a bright fauve palette and post-impressionist technique. She took a 6-week trip to coastal native sites in BC, traveling to the islands of the northwest coast, including what is Haida, Gwaii, as well as to the upper Skeena River. Whenever I could afford it, I went up north among the Indians and the woods and forgot all about everything in the joy of those lonely, wonderful places. I decided to try and make as good a representative collection of those old villages and wonderful totem poles as I could, for the love of the people and the love of the places and the love of the art. Whether anybody liked them or not, I painted them to please myself in my own way, but I also stuck rigidly to the facts because I knew I was painting history. The sentiment in that last sentence would be used against her by future critics. She worked directly on location and made watercolors, drawings, and field notes that she could later use as source material for studio paintings. This watercolor sketch was the source for the next painting. On the left is the fully developed oil painting, with another watercolor and graphite sketch on the right. She occasionally used photographs in making her paintings, acquiring them from professional photographers or from her traveling companions. Her totem poles and figures, as well as village scenes with local people, were all infused with the vibrant color, active brushwork, and reduced form of the French Fauvist school, as you can see in Yarn QCI on the left. The field sketches are also bold in composition and rich in color. The oils on canvas are large, confident paintings with thick, rich strokes of paint, as you can see in this vibrant painting of war canoes. Notice that she's introducing non-naturalistic color into the subjects. And here's Emily at work on the beach in Haida, Gwaii. And here is the final painting, Tanu, QCI. She uses sweeping strokes to create a moving, vibrant landscape from the beach to the totem poles to the dark forest and sky. The post-impressionist flat outlines she had learned in France helped her in creating a faithful, if rough, rendering of each figure carved into the poles. The color and treatment of the potlatch figure and the landscape again show strong Fauvist influence. Prior to 1884, potlatches had been held to celebrate clan occasions such as births, deaths, weddings, and so on. A feast would be held, attended by the clan and other guests, and hosted by the richer members of the community. This was accompanied by an exchange of gifts that was intended to redistribute wealth. The potlatch, along with other traditional Indigenous practices, was outlawed by the Canadian government between 1884 and 1951. This was part of the attempt to assimilate Indigenous people by banning their way of life, as well as their language. Emily also painted views of the city. This strongly Fauvist painting of Vancouver Street is in marked contrast to her more rigorous documenting of totems and villages in the north. It's as if she had been freed to paint as she really wanted. In 1913, at her own expense, Emily mounted an exhibition in Vancouver. She showed all her First Nation themed works, dating from the 1899 Ucluelet drawings and watercolors to the vivid oils and watercolors painted after she returned from France. Reaction to her paintings and the lecture she gave on them at the Dominion Hall was mixed. When she offered her paintings to the new Provincial Museum, they were refused. Feeling crushed, she returned to Victoria. In her talk, Lecture on Totems, she had described her understanding of Indigenous cultures, declaring finally, "I glory in our wonderful West, and I hope to leave behind me some of the relics of its first primitive greatness. These things should be to us Canadians what the ancient Britain's relics are to the English. Only a few more years, and they will be gone forever into silent nothingness, and I would gather my collection together before they are forever past." She claimed to understand Indigenous culture and called totemic art a relic of a past culture. Again, this would lead to criticism long after her death. Feeling humiliated and rejected, she took out a mortgage with her sister Alice and had Hill House built on the Carr property in Victoria. A studio space and 3 rental units were incorporated, and she lived there until 1936. This house was later immortalized in her book, The House of All Sorts. It would become the bane of her life. Being a landlady did not give Carr the free time to paint, nor did it make ends meet. Her own living quarters became smaller and smaller, and she started breeding purebred sheepdogs and keeping chickens and rabbits as an extra source of income. She established herself again as a political cartoonist and created and sold pottery with Indigenous motif decoration, signing herself Clee Wick. She also hooked rugs, again using Indigenous motifs, unwittingly creating more ammunition for her future critics. But she didn't paint seriously for another 13 years. 1927 is the year her luck changed. Eric Brown, the director of the National Gallery in Ottawa, and anthropologist Marius Barbeau invited Emily to exhibit in an exhibition of West Coast art, including Indigenous art, at the National Gallery in Ottawa. 26 of her paintings were included in the show, as well as rugs and pottery. En route to Ottawa, she met Group of 7 artist Frederick Valley in Vancouver, and she met Lauren Harris and other members of the Group of 7 in Toronto, staying overnight at their studio on 7th Street, which is now a private home. Lauren Harris and other members of the group would have a profound and lasting effect on Emily. Lauren Harris, in particular, admired her work and stated, "You are one of us." This is a humorous cartoon of her encounter with the Group of 7, created by Arthur Lismer. Lauren Harris is the tall figure with lots of hair, second from the right, and Emily is shown as a smiling, small, plump lady with a feather in her hat. Emily was particularly moved by the work of Lauren Harris. He was a theosophist, and his landscapes have a spiritual dimension to them that reflects his beliefs. Emily wrote, "Always something in it speaks to me, something in his big, tranquil space, filled with light and serenity. There is a holiness about them, something you can't describe, but just feel." Lauren Harris greatly supported Emily and her work and encouraged her through written correspondence for many years. But Harris was not the only spiritual and artistic influence on Emily. In 1928, she invited the Seattle artist Mark Tobey to come and teach a course at her studio. He belonged to the Baha'i world faith, which embraces all religions. Emily investigated the new spiritual and philosophic ideas, as well as ancient Chinese beliefs, but never rejected her own personal version of Christianity. Mark Tobey helped her to better see the structure of the forest and seems to have heightened her sense of rhythm and contrast in her compositions. Between 1928 and 1930, she made her last excursions to the First Nations villages, including many of the northern sites she had visited decades earlier, also the Nass and Skeena rivers and Haida Gwaii, then to Friendly Cove, and finally to Quatsino. Like the group of seven, she started to omit people from her paintings. Here, the windowless Indian church seems alien to the forest, both aloof and lifeless, in contrast to the color and energy in the tree canopy. The role of the church in the treatment of Indigenous people is brought into sharp focus by this painting, and its gallery label was changed by the AGO in 2018 because it was considered offensive. It's now labeled Church at Yuquot, but the archive retains the original title, Indian Church, intended by Emily Carr. In this village scene, both the people who created the carvings and the later residents are gone. Vanquished conveys mourning over ruin, defeat, and decay. The remains of the poles are like tombstones. The former Indigenous residents had been relocated since their earlier visits, and many poles had been dismantled. This added a sense of urgency to her personal mission, but this was increasingly in conflict with her goals as an artist. Emily came across this dramatic carving of Zonagwa in the forest and later wrote that she was quite affected by it. It's a figure from a local Indigenous story used to make children behave themselves. Zonagwa was a wild woman of the woods who traveled with a basket on her back. She would put naughty children into the basket, take them into the mountains, and eat them. The breasts are eagle heads with hooks for the beaks. The dramatic monumentality of the raven is reinforced through a more formal, stylized treatment of the subject. Notice the ordered precision of the shafts of light and strongly controlled layered contours of the landscape. This is not mere documentation of a historical object, but a fully developed painting, and it shows the strong influence of Lauren Harris's landscapes. Lauren Harris constantly advised her to abandon Aboriginal subjects and to work directly with the landscape to find herself as an artist rather than copying existing works of art. Emily eventually followed his advice and began to focus purely on landscape, finding her own spirituality and meaning in the forest she loved. The forest in these paintings seems to churn with life. Her paintings continued to be very dramatic. This red cedar has the same monumental presence as the raven. In these magnificent paintings, she organizes line, space, color, form, and movement into almost abstract compositions, using natural forms as a starting point, but not losing them altogether. She was invited to exhibit with the group of seven in 1930 and 1931. After they disbanded, she joined the Canadian group of painters. She also met up with Georgia O'Keeffe on a visit to New York, who had herself struggled to create her own vision of nature in a man's world. In 1932, Emily adopted a new painting technique. Partly in the interest of economy, she started painting in oils diluted with gasoline on manila paper. This terrified her friends, as she would always smoke heavily when she was working. The new medium gave the opacity of oil paint with the fluidity of watercolor and the flatness of surface that enabled her to paint in spontaneous, broad, sweeping gestures, full of energy and movement that you can see in sea and sky. Now, over the age of 60, Emily purchased a little caravan that could be towed and parked at the edge of the forest, enabling her to stay and work on site more easily. She nicknamed it the elephant. She was always surrounded by an entourage of animals, including her pet monkey Boo, and had long since earned a reputation as an eccentric who preferred animals to people. At the edge of the forest, Emily was faced with the results of heavy logging. Mining also had an impact on the coastal areas of BC. Like current photographer Ed Batinsky, Carr observed this human intervention with both horror and fascination, then created stunning works of art in recording it. She called the stumps left behind by loggers screamers and wrote, "It's a horrible sight to see a tree felled, even now, though the stumps are gray and rotting. As you pass among them, you see their screamers sticking up out of their own tombstones, as it were. They are their own tombstones and their own mourners." Despite her horror at the destruction, Emily created a series of wonderful paintings that often suggest hope. In Scorned as Timber, Beloved of the Sky, a spindly tree, rejected by the loggers, bravely reaches for the shimmering sky. On the right, the brilliant blue sky shines optimistically through bare tree trunks. Emily's original title for this painting was The Bounce of Spring. It expresses the energy and joy she found in nature in her later years of her painting career. The woods seem to move and swing as we are led along the path, past the stumps and into the light-filled clearing in the upper right. It's painted in oil on canvas, but has the same fluidity as her oils on paper. Again, Emily finds a powerful beauty in a depressing subject, the gravel pit. The movement in the sky might make you think of Van Gogh's skies. In 1937, Emily suffered her first heart attack. Her exhibition schedule in 1938 was demanding. She enjoyed her first annual solo exhibition at the Vancouver Art Gallery, as well as success at the Tate Gallery in London. But in 1939, she had a second heart attack. She returned her exploration of forest themes, both in their natural grandeur and in their violation by loggers. There is a sense of wonder and optimism in these works, and her palette is light and joyful. You can again see the fluidity of the diluted oil on paper in Sunshine and Tumult on the right. Once again, she's at the edge of the forest rather than in it due to the state of her health. This self-portrait has been created with quick, free brushstrokes. It shows a strong and determined artist who means business. Using the same technique, somberness sunlit is contradictory once again. There's life and optimism in a gloomy subject. Emily finally had to give up on field work due to ill health, and this drawing is from her last session. In 1942, Emily donated about 170 paintings to Vancouver Art Gallery, and this time they were gratefully accepted. In retirement and living with her sister Alice, who also had a house on the old Carr property, Emily was not a person who would sit idle for long. She had always kept a written and illustrated record of her activities and continued with her writing. Some of her stories were read on CBC radio, and in 1941, her first book, Clewick, was published. It was edited by her friend Ira Dilworth, who was at the time with the CBC. It won the Governor General's Award for Literary Merit in Nonfiction. 2 more books were published in her lifetime, with 5 more, including her notebooks, published posthumously. In recent years, ethical questions have been raised about Emily's work. Are Emily Carr's earlier paintings valid as art, or were they mere copies of someone else's art? Did she appropriate the imagery of indigenous cultures for her own benefit? Her pottery and rug hooking used indigenous motifs and were intended for sale to tourists in an industry that made money out of reproducing forbidden traditional objects. Confiscated original sacred objects were given to museums. Was she also guilty of being part of the so-called colonial gaze in her view of indigenous culture as something from the past that could and would no longer exist? The Aboriginal people would eventually be removed from her landscapes, as they were by the Group of Seven. In 2002, Marcia Crosby wrote an essay accusing Emily Carr and others of constructing the imaginary Indian. She is a Simpson Haida writer, art historian, and educator. She strongly criticizes both Canadian written history and historical visual art that places Indigenous peoples and their culture in the past tense. She demands that they be portrayed in a non-European context in the history books. A significant number of contemporary Indigenous artists have criticized this colonial gaze through their own art. One is Sunny Asu, a West Coast Indigenous artist from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, who was educated at the Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver. He created a series of digital interventions in the works of several well-known artists, including the Group of Seven and Emily Carr. In his interventions, he uses traditional Kwakwaka'wakw formline shapes like these, found in carving, pottery, painting, and rug making. This is one of a series of 15 works that he called Interventions on the Imaginary, in reference to Marcia Crosby's essay describing the imaginary Indian. He calls this Re-Invaders. He has scanned the image of the painting and used a computer program to insert into it ovoid motifs inspired by Kwakwaka'wakw art, but treated like sci-fi images of UFOs. The artist says that the neon ovoids negate the underlying colonial narrative of the original work. That narrative is the invasive Christian conversion of First Peoples by the dominant European culture. He says that the intervention affirms the persistence of our Aboriginal culture, despite the attempts to stamp it out, and that the paintings in which he intervenes become marked by the specter of native presence. This one's called Photobombing the Zonaqua. She gonna be mad. Sunny Asu uses humorous contemporary comic book slang in his titles to keep his comment lighthearted while making his point. The point here is that objects sacred to the First Nations, like Zonaqua, became nothing more than much photographed tourist attractions, much like the totem walk at Sitka. Well, here's Emily Carr's Tanu. Sunny Asu's title is Preserver 1. Well, it looks like we got them all. See, don't you feel great that these people will never experience the effects of colonization? Preserver 2. And the emoticon with the 2 zeros and the dash means surprised or confused. He uses comic book and texting dialogue to comment on the removal of people from Indian villages. This one is called The Away Team Beams Down to What Appears to Be an Uninhabited Planet. This has a similar theme, and the ovoids here project beam transportation to and from another world, as in the Star Trek series. In the titles, he wanted to use a language familiar to the current young generation. Quote, to form a dialogue about the true nature of the places shown in the paintings. He also questions whether traditional written English will look the same 100 years from now. This is one of Emily's 1912 Campbell River paintings. The Thunderbird image dominates the entrance to the graveyard. Sunny calls his intervention, what a great spot for a Walmart. Campbell River was Sunny Asu's indigenous grandmother's birthplace, and he now lives there himself with his wife and young family. And ironically, a Walmart was built close by. He targeted Emily Carr in his intervention series, but he does acknowledge that she had a genuine interest in recording the daily lives and places of a diverse group of people that she greatly admired. He also credits her with the courage to work outside the accepted realm of painting of her time, especially being a woman. Artists traditionally built their own form of expression on what came before in Western art, or borrowed from other cultures, as did Gauguin and Picasso. It wasn't until the Bauhaus teaching in Germany in the 1920s that ideas from former cultural models as a starting point were scrapped by artists and designers. Emily Carr was a woman of her time and background, but exceptional in her genuine pursuit of what art is. It would never have occurred to her that her work would later be resented or labeled as appropriation. She said, art is art, nature is nature. You cannot improve upon it. Pictures should be inspired by nature, but made in the soul of the artist. It is the soul of the individual that counts. Today, we have looked at Emily's soul only on a small screen. The actual paintings are far more powerful, as many of you know. She remains a great Canadian painter, and her personal story continues to fascinate, move, and inspire. I hope you will keep her in your thoughts if ever you retrace some of her footsteps in beautiful British Columbia or Haida, Gwaii. Thank you for your patience and enjoy your day.